I think in my next life, I want to be a sunflower and just spend all my days soaking in the sun. Hi guys, welcome back to the channel, and if you're new here, it's great to meet you. I'm Stella, and I'm kind of obsessed with making miniatures for my Barbie dollhouse using mostly cardstock. Today's video is my latest attempt at making miniature flowers, which I'm not known to be good at, so if you feel the same way, keep watching and we may learn something together. As always, I'll have free printable templates for you to download and they'll be linked in the video. So now let's begin. For starters, we're gonna need some terracotta pots. Now I've got a bit of a beef with the pre-made ones because they always seem to fall apart on me. Like always. Plus, you know, I'm all about DIY options. A very easy one is to use old espresso pods. They have just the right shape and size, and you can see how I turned them into 1/6 vases in this video. However, if you don't use Nespresso, you can make as many pots as you want out of cardstock. To make them, I started by cutting this part of the template. I used lightweight cardstock, but you can also use cardstock from old packaging as long as you peel off the printed layer. Next, I got a sponge, sprayed it with water, and used it to dampen the cardstock. This will soften it, making it more pliable and easier to shape. And as you can see here, skipping the step will leave us with a very wrinkly and uneven end piece. I used the handle of a paintbrush to give the card a bit of a rounded shape. Then I glued the two ends together to create this sort of half cone. Next, I cut this circle 3 times and glued the layers together like this. I attached the resulting piece to the base of the pot. Then I cut this strip, dampened it with water, and glued it around the top part of the vase. I repeated the same process for these 2 parts to create the rim of the pot. Now at this stage, the vase looked very much like paper, so to make it appear more realistic, I started by concealing this junction line with a little bit of spackle. Then I covered the entire piece with acrylic gesso, applied with a makeup sponge to get this nice, spongy, I guess, texture. Finally, I painted the vase in a terracotta-like color, once again applied with a sponge. And you can play around scaling the template up or down to make a bunch of pots in several different sizes. With the pots ready, I started working on my miniature flowers. To make a little sunflower, I cut this part into copy paper, and I used yellow paper, but if you don't have it, you can just use regular white paper and paint it with watercolors, acrylic paints, or markers. I personally prefer alcohol markers because they color both sides of the paper at once, and that's super convenient. And if you're using my free printable template, I think that the easiest way to cut this part is to fold it in half and then in half again before cutting it. The result may not be quite as precise as the machine cut one, but once you assemble the flowers, it shouldn't really be noticeable. And if you do have a Cricut or Silhouette cutting machine, you can simply use my digital templates, which you can find in my shop, linked in the description. This will make the process quite faster. To add some shading to the petals, I tried something kinda new, at least for me, and I used chalks because I wanted to achieve a really soft gradient. And you can see the difference between the plain petals and the colored ones here. Next, I use a fine dotting tool to emboss each and every petal so that it would look a little more three-dimensional. And here I tried to get as close as possible with my phone so you could see it better. Finally, I glued the 3 layers together, rotating them a little so that the petals would be kind of crisscrossed, if that makes sense. Next, I cut this part, and just like I did for the previous one, I colored it with chalks. And then I embossed all the individual petals. I glued the 2 layers on top of the ones I assembled earlier. Then I cut this part, and since I didn't have any green paper, I painted it with my alcohol markers. Once again, I used my fine dotting tool to emboss all the leaves. Then I glued the resulting piece to the back of my little sunflower. To make the stem, I used floral wire. I like this type of wire because it's wrapped in paper, which makes it very easy to color and glue. I slid the wire into this little hole in the flower, then I bent it like this. Trimmed it, and fixed it with some glue. To make the central part of the flower, I used some micro glass beads, and if you haven't gotten them yet, I highly suggest you do because they're fairly inexpensive and so incredibly versatile. I'll have them linked in the description just in case, along with all the other supplies I used for this project. I cut this part and I dipped it into the bead jar. Then I painted the resulting element, starting with a dark brown base. And then I added some black and yellow dots here and there. I attached the final piece to the rest of the flower. Then I cut a bunch of leaves, and once again, since I didn't have any green paper at hand, I colored them with markers. And I didn't spend too much time on it since I plan to add more shading after attaching the leaves to the stem. Next, I used a fine dotting tool to emboss the veins on each leaf this way. And I struggled a bit while filming this part, but I hope you can see it well enough. Once all the leaves were ready, I attached them to the stem using hot glue. And I gotta say, I generally don't love using hot glue, but it was kinda perfect for this since it dries so fast and it let me angle the leaves just right. Finally, I painted the leaves with acrylic paints to add a little more depth. I made a few more sunflowers and then I moved them into one of my miniature pots. To make the soil, I used some ground coffee. I simply emptied a couple of old used coffee pods and then let them dry out for a couple days. Now, I typically glue the flowers into their vase, but this time I wanted the option to move them around, you know, in case I ever want to place them in a different vase. So I came up with this sort of alternative method. But I'm gonna show you how to secure the flowers in a more permanent way in just a minute. Next up, I tried to make a miniature orchid. To make the flower, I started by cutting this part into white copy paper and then I colored it with my alcohol markers. And I was trying to achieve a sort of gradient effect. Next, I drew some lines on each petal with a red pencil, just to add that little extra level of detail. I did that for both sides of the petals. Just as I did for sunflowers, I used the dotting tool to emboss the petals and make them appear a little more three-dimensional. Next, I cut this part and I repeated the exact same steps as before, so I colored the petals with my markers. Added some extra details with a pencil. And finally, I embossed the petals with a dotting tool. And as you can see, I used a fine-tipped one to sort of pull each petal's tip into a drop-like shape. Lastly, I cut this part and I colored it yellow, leaving the very top part of each petal white. I colored the center of both parts with a red pencil. And finally, I embossed each tiny petal with my fine dotting tool. I assembled all the parts to make two tiny flowers. And then I pretty much repeated the same process to make these other four smaller ones. To make the stem, I once again used a piece of floral wire, which I bent a little to give it a sort of L shape. Then I used my hot glue gun to add two teeny tiny branches to the top end of the wire this way. And then I used two small beads to make a couple of flower buds. I painted the stem with green acrylic paint, using two different shades to make it appear a little more realistic. finally, I glued the flowers to the stem this way. Now, this time I wanted the flower to be permanently attached to its vase, so I filled the pot with some fiber fill that I then covered with a layer of coffee to mimic the soil. And you can substitute the fiber fill with a cotton pad or a piece of foam. Next, I cut another piece of floral wire and I inserted it into the soil like this. And then I placed the orchid right next to it. I attached the stem and the second piece of floral wire together. And then I glued 3 short pieces of sewing thread around the wires, basically as if it was like twine. To make the leaves, I cut this part and painted all the pieces green. I embossed and shaped all the leaves using a medium and a small dotting tool. And then I glued all the leaves to the pot this way. Next, I painted the leaves with a darker shade of green paint so that they would look a little more three-dimensional. And finally, I coated them with a light layer of clear varnish. And our miniature sunflowers and orchid are ready. As promised, here's a link to the free printable templates. And if you're feeling in the right mood for more dollhouse flowers, you'll probably enjoy watching this video next. And this is all for today. Until next time, bye bye!